Hi, and welcome back to my channel. Or if you're a returning subscriber, hi again. It's so nice to see you back here for another video. My name's Tesslark, and today I'm going to show you how you can make a geode rainbow catcher using epoxy resin, mica powder, some crushed glass, and real crystals. As always, I'll have all the materials that I used for this project linked in the description below, so if you want to try it for yourself, all of that information will be down there for you. And let's just hop into today's video. To save some time in this video, I pre-mixed 100 milliliters of resin, and I'm going to be adding some light plum mica powder by Arteza to that to change the color of my resin. This mold holds 100 milliliters of resin, so I went ahead and I mixed up 50 milliliters of resin plus 50 milliliters of hardener, and now I'm just adding my pigment to that. A good way to check how opaque or translucent your resin is to look and see what it looks like on the bottom of the popsicle stick. So my resin was still a bit too translucent, so I'm just adding a bit more mica powder here, and then I'm going to thoroughly incorporate that, making sure that I'm scraping both the sides and the bottom of my container as I go. After I've got that mixed up, I'll hit it with the heat gun really quickly to pop some bubbles that may be forming on the surface, and then I'll begin to fill my mold. So I'm just going to go ahead and slowly fill up my mold, making sure that I'm getting a nice even layer throughout the entire piece, and I'm also making sure that I'm not going to overfill my mold. This project will take a couple days, so this is going to be our first step to make the base of our piece. So next I'm going to go ahead and hit this with my heat gun one more time, again to pop any of those little bubbles that may be forming. And because this piece does have a bit of a lip to it, I like to use my popsicle stick to just go right along the edge and pop any bubbles that may be forming there. And then I'll let this piece cure for about 24 hours before I demold it. So we're time traveling a little bit, and I'm just going to go ahead and demold this piece, and the next step is going to be to attach some of my larger crystals using some hot glue. So I'm just taking a little dab of hot glue and I'm attaching my crystals in clusters of 2 or 3s. And when you're placing your crystals, you want to make sure that you're not placing them too close to the edge, because we will be putting down a layer of some crushed glass to give more of a geode effect. So you just want to make sure you're giving yourself a little bit of working space. Our next step will be to mix up another small batch of resin, and for this I'm going to be using 40 milliliters total of resin. So I've just measured 20 milliliters of resin, and I'm going to add 20 milliliters of hardener to that. And then I'll mix those two parts together for 5 or so minutes, making sure that I'm scraping both the sides and the bottom of my container as I go. And when you're mixing resin, you'll notice it'll start getting cloudy and then it clears up again. And that's typically how I know that I've mixed my resin enough. I do like to let it sit for another few minutes just to allow some of those bubbles to come up to the surface, and then we'll move right along. First, I'm going to take a little bit of that clear resin and just pour it down around the base of my crystals. And you don't need too much here because the resin is going to spread out quite a bit. So I've just laid down enough that I think that I can kind of coat the bottom where I want my crushed glass to go. Once I've got a thin layer of resin down around the base of my crystals, I'm going to go ahead and put some of this chunky crushed glass right on top of that resin. And don't worry if it's a little bit messy, you can always clean it up later. I like to use a clean paintbrush just to kind of clean up those edges. I'll also add a little bit more crushed glass to little areas that I think needs a little bit more, like where you can see some of the resin kind of poking through, and just make sure that that line is really nice and clean before moving on. And so next up, I'm just going to separate out some of my clear resin into a couple smaller cups to start mixing up some colors. And because this piece is relatively small and I don't want the colors to take over the entire piece, I really don't need all that much resin. But the majority of color that I will need is white, because for this piece I'm going to be using white as my background color and then a darker pink and a lighter pink for the accent colors. So I've just added some Pinata Colors Blanco Blanco alcohol ink to my clear resin, and I'm also going to add some Periwinkle Glow by Arteza. It's this really lovely mica powder that adds a really pretty blue sheen to the finished product. So just mixing that up and making sure it's as opaque as I want it, and then I'll move along and mix up my other colors. And to make my lighter pink, I could have just used some of that pre-mixed white and added some of my pink to it, but for whatever reason, I decided not to do it that way. So I'm using the same combination of colors for my smaller cup, and I'm just mixing that in. And then I'm gonna add some of the pink resin to this white because I do want it to be a pretty light pink, so I don't want to add the mica powder directly to that white. So once again, going in with that same mica powder that I used for the base of my project, I'm just going to go ahead and mix that into this smaller cup. Then I'm going to transfer a little bit of that pink into my white just to get a nice light pink color. I feel like this is a good time to remind you that if you are liking this video so far, please don't forget to give it a like. It not only helps out my channel a whole lot, but it also lets me know that I'm making content that you guys want to see from me. Now that I've got my colors mixed up, I'm going to go ahead and start to layer some of that white down around the base of my crushed glass. After that, I'm going to add just a small line of my lighter pink and my darker pink, and then a little bit more white, adding another line of the colors on top of that. Then I'll use my heat gun to start warming up all of that resin before I use the heat gun to start pushing out those colors to make cells. And you want to warm up the resin before you get too close and start pushing the colors together, because as the resin gets more hot, it gets more liquid and easier to push around. You don't want to do too much pushing or you can start to muddy up your piece a bit. I'm also going to tilt this piece a little bit, and then I'll reinforce some of those darker lines using my darker pink color. Next, I have this thinner crushed glass. It's really pretty. It has a bit of an iridescent shine to it. And I'm just going to take a little bit of that and go right up against that top edge, cleaning that up with my paintbrush, and then I'm going to go ahead and let this layer cure completely before we move on. But first, I will prop this piece up slightly because I don't want the resin to spread any further up the piece than it already is. And then after my crescent has cured for another 24 hours, I'm going to go ahead and add another layer of that thinner, finer crushed glass for some more texture. So I went ahead and I just mixed up about 10 milliliters of resin, and again, I've got that fine crushed glass. I'm going to pour some of that into a cup, and then I'm going to add a little bit of my resin to that. And I'm only adding enough resin to this to make sure that everything is sticking and clumping together and it's a bit of a paste consistency, but I don't want the resin to spread out over the entire piece. So I want really it just to act as like an adhesive to each other and to the crescent. And then I've transferred that crushed glass into a sandwich baggie, which I'll be using as a piping bag. So I just cut a big hole on one of the ends of that sandwich bag, and I'm going to use that to pipe some of my crushed glass, and then use a popsicle stick to sort of clean up those lines and get them exactly how I want them to be. And it's been a while, but my cat says hello. After that layer of texture is cured, let's go ahead and add some more lines and some more detail to our piece using a Deco Premium Color paint pen. And for this piece, I'm using a metallic silver. So I'm just going to go ahead and carefully reinforce some of those larger lines and then add a few more detail lines to my piece. This project is a little bit time intensive as it does take a few days for the layers to cure in between, but I always love how these turn out, so they're one of my favorite resin art projects to make, to be honest. And I know quite a few of you guys that watch my videos are resin artists yourself, so I'm wondering, what are your favorite projects to make with resin art? Leave me a comment below and let me know what you're working on or what some of your favorite projects to date are. After I'm happy with how the inside of the piece is looking and I've added enough metallic details, I'm going to go ahead and take my paint pen and just go around the outside rim of the entire piece. And while I'm doing this, I'm just making sure that I'm not touching the wet paint because it does take a few moments for it to dry, so you definitely don't want to smudge it or leave any fingerprints. After I get this paint pen down, I'm going to let it dry for about 20 minutes, and then I'll be pouring the last layer of resin as a top coat. And I'm really not going to use too much resin to top coat this piece, so I've mixed up another 10 milliliters here, and I'm just going to go ahead and add that right on top of my piece. And the top coat is going to help to keep that paint pen in place so it doesn't chip over time. It's also going to give a really nice glossy finish to the entire piece, as well as secure down any loose crystal or piece of crushed glass. And as you can see here, I'm just using my fingers to spread out that resin nice and thin because I don't want it to drip over the sides. Then I'll hit it with my heat gun again to kind of thin out that resin and pop some bubbles. And after I'm done, I'll let it cure completely. So now that the last layer of resin has cured on this piece, let's go ahead and attach the hardware so that it can hang. And we're also going to attach a little rainbow catching crystal to the centerpiece right here. Whenever you're sanding resin, you want to take the proper precautions to make sure that you're not going to aspirate any of the little particles that you make, and you want to make sure it's not going to get into your eyes. So I'm going to go ahead and put on my safety goggles and an N95 mask. And as always, I'm working in a really well ventilated space, and as soon as I'm not recording, I'll go ahead and turn on my air filter. To start out, let's go ahead and wire wrap our crystal. So I'm going to take a length of about 7 to 8 inches of some jeweler's wire and give that a cut with my jewelry pliers. Next, I'm taking one of my crystals, which is already top drilled at the top. So I'm just going to thread that wire through the pre-drilled hole until it's right about in the middle. Next, I will pull both of those wires up so that the crystal is evenly centered, and then I'll take one of those wires and start to wrap it around the other one. I'll pull one of the wires facing up and the other one to the side, and using my needle nose pliers, I'm going to pull that wire right around the top to make a little loop. Next step is going to be to wrap that first wire right around that to make sure that it's really tightly secured. And once I've got it down, I'll go ahead and cut the tail off using my pliers to make sure that it's laying down really flat. Next, we'll take that other side of the wire and wrap that around the pre-existing little stand that we've made for our crystal, kind of filling in those gaps, and we'll cut off that tail, tamp it down again, and then we'll set this off to the side. Our next step will be to drill our piece so we can attach the hardware to it, but before I drill into my resin, I like to mark the places where I'm going to be drilling using a Sharpie, just so I know exactly where to make my holes before I start drilling. So once again, I'm going to go ahead and put on my goggles or my eye goggles and a face mask, and then I'll be using this little tool to go ahead and drill into my piece, making sure that I'm drilling straight down and not going too deep into the piece. And again, I will have all the materials that I use for this project down below, so if you're curious about this drill or anything else that I'm using, all of that information is going to be down there for you guys. And if you'd like to see more resin art videos from me, don't forget to subscribe, as I do post weekly. So I'm drilling my last little hole here, again making sure that I'm not going too deep into it. And then after I'm done, I'll go ahead and clean up this piece and then begin to attach the hardware. In order to reinforce my jewelry hooks and make sure that they're in there really well, I'm going to be using some jeweler's glue or E6000 glue, and I'm going to be putting that on the tip of my little eye screws before I screw them into the piece. So I'm just putting a little bit of that glue on a piece of wax paper, and then after I get that glue down, I'll take one of my eye screws and I'll put a little dab of glue right onto the tip of that eye screw before I start to screw it into my piece. And again, when you're screwing your eye screws into your piece, you want to make sure you're screwing them in nice and flat and even. I also like to make sure that they're lined up flat or parallel with the edge of the piece. It just helps them to lay a little bit flatter and a little bit more nicely when the piece is complete. I also will often use my pliers right at the end there to get a couple more turns and make sure that it's really nice and tight. Now that we have our eye screws attached, we're going to be attaching some chain to our piece to finish it up. So I'm going to be making 2 lengths of chain, one that's going to be roughly 3 or 4 inches to use it to actually hang the piece to the wall. And the next will be about 1/4 to 1/2 inch of length in order to attach our crystal onto the piece. And to attach our chain, we're just going to be using some jump rings. So using my jewelry pliers to hold the jump ring in place and another set of pliers to open up that jump ring, I'm going to go ahead and attach one end of that jump ring onto my longer chain and then attach that onto the eye screws that are at the top of my piece. Next, I'll use my pliers to just go ahead and make sure that jump ring is really tightly closed. You want to make sure you've got a really nice strong bond so that the piece doesn't fall off of the wall or off of wherever it's hanging from. And then I'll repeat that process on the other side, opening up that jump ring and attaching the other side of the chain. And then once again, we'll close up that jump ring using our pliers and make sure that it's laying down nice and flat and is really tightly secured. Now that we have our first chain attached, let's go ahead and attach our crystal. I'll start by opening up another one of my jump rings, and I'm going to go ahead and attach that to the loop that we made previously on the top of our crystal. Next, I'm going to attach that to one side of my chain, and then I'll go ahead and close that jump ring, again making sure that it's really tight and very secure. Next, we'll open another jump ring and attach this to our piece. So we've got that jump ring open there, we'll attach it to the other side of the chain, and after we get it into that little loop through the chain, we'll put it onto the top eye screw at the top of our crescent. And sometimes this is a little tricky because there's just not a lot of space to work in here, but you can always use your needle nose pliers if that's a little bit better. I absolutely love this geode. If you'd like to see more resin geode tutorials from me, I do have a few here on my YouTube channel, so I'll make sure to link those down below. As always, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for spending part of your day with me, especially if you made it all the way to the end of this video. And if you did make it all the way to the end of the video, leave me some sort of food-related emoji just to confuse anyone who hasn't made it this far. I really hope that this video inspires you to make something of your own today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!